Content warning. This episode contains discussions of sensitive and potentially distressing topics, including domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, coercive control, and trauma. If you or someone you know is affected by these issues, support is available. In Australia, you can contact 1-800-RESPECT or the National Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Counselling Service on 1-800-737-732. Lifeline is 131114. Listener discretion is advised. Please take care of yourself when listening to this, and if you need to stop and come back to it, we recommend that you do.
Step into the realm of daring ideas and transformative dialogues. This is Voices from the Edge, the podcast that pushes boundaries and ventures beyond the ordinary. Here, we confront the crucial issues that shape our world today. From the heartbeat of community challenges to the untold chronicles of leadership. From the relentless pursuit of social justice to the essential lessons in safety and lifelong learning. Voices from the Edge takes you to the crossroads of change. Because the edge is not just a boundary, it's where growth happens. It's where the real conversations begin. So lean in, be inspired, and let's explore what lies beyond the edge.
And joining us today is the marvellous Cathy Oddie.
Cathy Oddie is a victim survivor of domestic, family, and sexual violence by multiple perpetrators. She became a lived experience advocate in 2007 and since then has given evidence at the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence and other state and federal government inquiries to inform legislative and policy changes. She is a community member on Victoria's Adult Parole Board. Cathy has worked professionally in roles supporting victim survivors of domestic, family, and sexual violence, and co-designing service delivery improvements at organizations, including Victoria Legal Aid, the Victims of Crime Consultative Committee, La Trobe University Bendigo, and as a specialist family violence practitioner at Goulburn, Orange Door and Berry Street, Ballarat.
Cathy, how are you?
I'm great. How about yourself?
Good. How is the lovely state of Victoria today?
Well, today in Ballarat, which is about 2 hours northwest of Melbourne, for those who are not aware, it's been quite grey and rainy, which, to be honest, is welcome because we're in severe drought conditions. So we need some more of this wet weather.
Good. We've, I think we've about a third of our usual rain for this time of year over here in Perth. So it's wonderful weather, unless you actually want to grow anything or if you have a farm or anything like that.
True.
So, Cathy, I brought you on because you're, I guess, an expert in some of these these fields that some people find difficult to have conversations about. But I think we really need to have some conversations about these. So, first up, I want to ask you about a term which, until recently, I didn't even know existed, and neither did my wife. My wife was quite shocked, and she actually said to me, she said, Why is it that in our society we even need a term like this, let alone have it? So, first of all, what is femicide?
So femicide is defined as intentional killing with a gender-related motivation. It is different from homicide, where the motivation may not be gender-related. Femicide is driven by discrimination against women and girls, unequal power relations, gender stereotypes, or harmful social norms. It is the most extreme and brutal manifestation of violence against women and girls, which occurs on a continuum of multiple and related forms of violence at home, in workplaces, schools, public spaces, including intimate partner violence, sexual harassment, and other forms of sexual violence, harmful practices and trafficking. In 2023, around 51,100 women and girls worldwide were killed by their intimate partners or other family members. This means that on average, 140 women or girls are killed every day by someone in their own family. Current and former intimate partners are by far the most likely perpetrators of femicide, accounting for an average of 60% of all intimate partner and family-related killings. In many cases, only gender-related killings perpetrated by an intimate partner or family member are counted as femicides, yet we know that gender-related killings take place in many contexts beyond the private sphere. They can be related to rape or sexual violence by someone unknown to the victim, linked to harmful practices such as female genital mutilation or so-called honour killings. They can be as a result of hate crimes linked to sexual orientation or gender identity and connected with armed conflict, gangs, human trafficking and other forms of organised crime. Last year recorded the highest number of femicides perpetrated by intimate partners or family members, indicating that the world is failing to stop deaths that could be prevented through early intervention, gender-responsive policing and justice, and access to survivor-centred support and protection. Here in Australia, we're not doing any better in that context. So Sherelle Moody, who's an incredible First Nations journalist and activist, she collates what's called the Australian Femicide Watch. And as we stand right now, 28 Australian women have been killed so far this year. 3 of those women died in the last week. In 2024, we lost 103 women to violence. So the deaths toll now stands at 131 women and 27 children killed in Australia in the last 17 months.
Mm-hmm. All right. In terms of, I don't know, I hate to say the word performance, how is Australia tracking compared to other sort of, I don't know, westernised, we can call them westernised countries like the US and the UK, or first world countries? Are we doing per capita better or worse? Is there any sort of figures around that?
Well, I wouldn't be able to quote those two off the top of my head, but I'd say that we're fairly comparable to other Western nations. Unfortunately, family violence, gender-based violence is something that impacts every single country on this earth. Obviously, in countries where you have a lot more extremes in how, in the way that the gender balance is treated. Say, if we're looking at, say, maybe some countries like Afghanistan, you're going to experience much, much higher rates of gender-based violence in those types of countries. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that what we're experiencing here is any less serious. Like, you know, the fact that we have people dying, 3 in the last week, that's 3 families, 3 communities. Then you extrapolate that across all these deaths that are happening on a daily basis worldwide. Like, there's a family violence incident that's being reported to police here in Australia every 10 minutes. It's shocking.
That's a pretty scary figure, every 10 minutes. Is there any figures about which can demonstrate whether things are in Australia in particular actually getting worse or better?
They are getting worse, but then you have to look at this on 2 ways, because yes, the numbers are increasing, because as I was saying, like in terms of the amount of people, women and children whose lives have been taken, if we look at it year on year, they have been increasing in the last, just even if we look at the last 5 years, each year it's been more, which is absolutely devastating. But on the other aspect, when we're looking at the numbers of those whose lives have been taken, that's just the tip of a very massive iceberg of people impacted by these issues, because we can't forget all of those who are not actually murdered and are living and surviving this on a day-to-day basis, such as myself. I've survived 2 long-term abusive relationships, and there, but for the grace of God, I could have been murdered. In fact, you know, my first perpetrator in particular actively tried to kill me on a number of occasions. But what I've seen is why I said we've got to look at that statistics in a couple of ways, because yes, there is the increase, but also we have an increase of awareness and support services that particularly have come into place post the Royal Commission into Family Violence in Victoria in 2015. And because that has then resulted in greater state and federal allocations of funding to services, and the media campaigns, people are more aware of where they can get support. So given that domestic, family and sexual violence are the types of crimes that are very much underreported, regardless of gender, because as we know, men can also be victims of family violence. So we need to look at the increase of domestic, family and sexual violence, as I said, in two different respects. That one, yes, there is an actual increase in incidents, but two, there's an increase in reporting because people are feeling more comfortable and aware of where they can actually report and know that they're going to get assistance and financial support and things like that, and the justice responses are more effective. And so when you've got crimes that are traditionally so underreported, that yet again, even now, when we look at an increased reporting pattern, it's still something that many people don't end up reporting these crimes to the police for various reasons. So even the things that I've reported as statistical stuff here is still only really based on what is actually reported to specialist service providers and law enforcement agencies around the world. And so anyone who sees these things in the media or in newspaper in different formats should very much bear in mind it's always going to be the tip of the iceberg, because there's so much that happens behind the scenes that people might never feel comfortable to actually come forward, or it might take them many years. Like for me, for one set of crimes I experienced with a police officer who, when I was actually trying to seek help regarding stalking that I was experiencing from my first perpetrator, and instead of that police officer actually doing something to investigate the crimes I was reporting to him, he instead became a perpetrator towards me as well, and he went on to rape me for a 12-month period. And it took me 18 years to actually report that police officer because I was too scared. But thankfully, in 2022, when I did report him, I was taken seriously. They thoroughly investigated, and that police officer, who at that stage was of inspector rank, is now no longer a police officer. So I would have not felt that I could have done that in 2004, 2005 when he was offending against me, because it just was a whole different world. So that's why I say that, like, now we do have higher figures that are being reported, but at the same time, we've got a bigger safety net for people to actually access.
My name is Luca.
Now, family violence, we're talking about the very top end where people actually die when we talk about femicide or gender-based violence, which leads to people dying. Does that happen just as a one-off, or is it sort of start off at a very low level and builds and builds and builds over time usually?
Well, family violence, which can encapsulate a range of types of violence and can have different names such as domestic abuse, intimate partner violence and so forth, and be made up of abuse types such as emotional abuse, verbal abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, dowry abuse, visa abuse, gaslighting and so forth, that people might not necessarily experience every single form of those abuse in the context of the relationship they're in, but it is very unlikely that they're only going to be experiencing one type. I've, in my professional work as a specialist family violence practitioner and working in other roles, every single victim survivor I've supported has experienced a range of abusive behaviours. And what I guess there's a term that's become more accepted in recent years to actually describe that pattern of behaviours that people experience, which also encapsulates the behaviours that will be perpetrated against you, which are very controlling and isolating. And the accepted term that's started to be adopted, particularly I'd say post-2020, is the term coercive control. So coercive control is a persistent pattern of controlling, coercive and threatening behaviour, including all or some forms of domestic abuse by a partner or ex-partner or a family member. It traps victims in a relationship and makes it impossible or dangerous to leave. So an example of that in my situation was, yet again, the first perpetrator. We're a year into that relationship. It was my birthday. I was in my early 20s at the time. All I wanted to do for my birthday was go and see a movie. He was invited to come with me, but whatever on that day, an argument ensued which escalated to hours of him physically being violent towards me, holding me hostage at gunpoint because he had access to unregistered firearms that he held onto on behalf of underworld crime gang that he was associated with dealing drugs for, unfortunately. So if people are familiar with the Underbelly series, we were living in Brunswick at the time. He was working in a fruit and vegetable shop, which is how he got drawn into that Italian mafia world, just to give some context to that. So anyway, there I am, barricaded in an upstairs room, injured. He's threatening to kill me. I just happened to didn't have a mobile phone in those days, but I had, for context, this was 2002. I had the cordless handset of our home phone in the room, called 000, told them what was going on. When police turned up, he answered the door downstairs, put on the charm and was like, nothing to see here sort of approach. The police, they came up and they were asking, what do you want? And I said, I just want to get out of the house. They didn't arrest him. They didn't take us back to the station to take our statements. They didn't talk to my neighbours to talk about the fact that I'd been, they would have heard me screaming, all sorts of stuff. At that point for me, I was in that flight mode, because people might have heard of things like the fight, flight, freeze, and also there's fawn. So in that moment, I just wanted to get out of that house and I wanted to go somewhere safe. So they said, well, where do you want to go? I didn't have a car at that point in my life. So I said, take me down to the main intercity station, which is Southern Cross Station in Melbourne, so I can catch a train back to the country where my family live. And this is the nature of coercive control. By this stage, he'd been so successful in isolating me from my loved ones, and the psychological abuse of every time I attempted to leave, by this stage I'd already attempted a couple of times, he would say to me, and he'd have a knife at my throat, if you leave me, I will bury you, I'll kill you and bury you in the backyard, and then I'll go after your friends and family and kill them. And he'd broken my sense of self-worth down so much that I didn't actually care what happened to me at that point, but I didn't want anyone I loved to be killed. So it might seem absolutely outrageous to anyone who's watching this podcast that what I did when the police dropped me off at Southern Cross Station, did I catch a train back to Ballarat? No, I actually got back on a train and went to the station right near where I lived in Brunswick and went straight back to the house. And my birthday present from him was then to strangle me to the point of unconsciousness and, further physically assault me. And then for the remaining 2.5 years of that relationship, followed by the 10 years of stalking, but whilst it was still in the active relationship, he would say to me when he'd be doing things like breaking my bones or pouring boiling water on me or doing whatever he might be doing, he'd say, "Oh, you're just going to call the police, aren't you?" And he goes, "Oh, yeah, well, go ahead. What did they do last time they came? Nothing. Go on, call them." Because this is the thing, if they'd actually done anything like arrest him, take a statement, also they didn't take me to the hospital to get my injuries treated, anything like that, no referrals to a family violence specialist service, which did exist back then. What's now known as Safe Steps Family Violence Response Centre was back then known as Women's Domestic Violence Crisis Service. If they'd done anything more than just dump me at the train station, anything would have helped. But because it emboldened him to actually escalate his behaviours. And the implied threat is what that coercive control. He didn't even though he did go on to assault me many more times, there would be so many times as well that it was just the implied threat that he would do something, that it was enough to stop me or to get me to do what he wanted me to do. And that's what the coercive control is about.
Yeah. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'm sorry anyone has to go through that sort of stuff. But, all right, coercive control. People doing coercive control, does it always, or at least, is there a pattern of escalation that usually happens, that if the behaviours aren't addressed, they just keep escalating up, starting with some measure of, controlling some part, isolating people, then it builds up to violence, etc.?
Absolutely. And I would also make it clear that not every abusive relationship physical or sexual violence exists, but that doesn't make them any less abusive, because psychological and verbal abuse and financial abuse and other things such as dowry abuse in culturally and linguistically diverse communities and visa abuse, these are absolutely horrific forms of abuse in and of themselves independently. But yes, there is a progression. And what I like to say in terms of describing this is, you would not commence a relationship with someone if the first thing they did to you was punch you in the face. I can't imagine anyone doing that. And that's exactly the case it's been for me and so many victim survivors I've supported professionally. That in my case, it started in both relationships. And in fact, this is also very typical for so many victim survivors, that their perpetrator, regardless of whether it's a man or a woman, they're very charming, likeable individuals in their outside persona that they present. We often hear that term, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it is very much like that, because people who met my two perpetrators, who are their mates, who are like you hear that, "I bet he was a good guy at the footy club." That's the sort of comments you would have probably heard reflected about my perpetrators. They were very funny, very talented. The first one's very talented musically. They had a lot to like about them. They weren't monsters. This is the thing about perpetrators of abuse. They do horrific behaviours towards their victims, but that doesn't make them these ogres hiding in the dark. They could be your neighbour. They could be someone you're working with. There's someone in your family. They're just human beings who are doing these really, really awful things to another human because they want to have control and power over that individual. So what I found in my case is it started off with particularly thinking back in that first relationship, that and that was a point, being in my 20s at that time, that I didn't have a language to describe abuse. I hadn't ever experienced it growing up. So when we would go out with his friends and my friends, and he'd be making jokes at my expense or saying disrespectful comments about me, his friends would laugh. My friends would be, you could say they're looking uncomfortable. I'm feeling awful, but I'm not knowing, I didn't have the, I guess, that sense of being able to challenge that behaviour and speak up against it. And because particularly in the early stages, you know, you're wanting things to work out and you've got that hope that things will be all right. And when you're out in a group environment and no one else is challenging the behaviours, this is why it's so important that when you're in a situation where you can be an active bystander and you're seeing someone being talked to disrespectfully, that you do actually call that out. Because that person who is being disrespected, it might not be safe for them to actually be the person to challenge the other individual. So it started like that. And then at the time when I met that person, I was living in a share house with two of my best female friends. It was a lovely feminine house, and actually how I'd got to know that perpetrator is that he was mates with a share house of guys just down the road. And they were all from the country. Me and my female friends were from the country. So we had so much in common. In fact, my perpetrator, his father, used to work with my dad, not till that we realised that until after getting to know each other a bit more. So we'd come from his hometown's only sort of 30, 40 minutes away from where I grew up. It was no different to any other guy that I'd grown up with. And so no red flags going, oh, this is someone that I should avoid like the plague. He was just so completely normal in context of any country bloke. So my friends were starting to feel really uncomfortable with the way I was being treated. And in the back of what I wasn't getting to see was that he was going behind my back and actually degrading me to them and saying that I was doing things regarding them that I wasn't. And so it actually got to a point where they moved out of the house and ended their friendship with me because of all these lies he was making up. And that then created a pathway that he moved in with his two younger brothers. And that then just completely changed the dynamic of my house. The risk and the level of violence escalated completely because, for example, he withheld his behaviours slightly when my two female friends were still living in the house. But when it was him and his two younger brothers, who they absolutely idolised him, he could have me on the ground kicking me or doing other things and they wouldn't intervene. So it's when they see these perpetrators that they can keep inching what they can get away with, that I have not ever seen any victim survivor who's been in an abusive relationship where it's de-escalated. It just keeps adding on and adding on. And that's what I'm saying. Like in my case, I'm very lucky I'm still alive today because he actively did try to end my life. And then there are other times where, because I was so fearful of what was going on, and I'd never experienced any mental health related issues prior to that relationship. And as a result of, and the following abuse that I received in relationships and circumstances after him, such as being raped by the police officer and raped by a stranger, I now live with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety and depression. And when I was in that relationship, there were times where, as I said, he was actively threatening my family and friends should I leave him. So there were a number of times that I attempted to end my own life because I thought this is the only way I can make this nightmare stop, but not actually put my family at risk, because if I kill myself, then he's not going to go after them. But I can't deal with this anymore. And this is, I think when we look at those statistics I read out earlier about the women and children who've been murdered, what that doesn't include, that statistic, is all the women who've ended their own lives as a result of the abuse, just like in what I was also close to doing as well on a number of occasions.
Yeah. Just a few things there. With escalating behaviour, and you said, and it's what I've actually seen too, I see people escalate, and you go, if you stay with this person, sooner or later you will be dead, which is a terrible thing to have to say to someone, but it's something I've had to say to them. Do interventions work? Is there anywhere
intervention orders or support?
Interventions to basically reroute the behaviour.
Okay. As in men's behaviour change type?
Yeah.
Okay. I think, yes, they definitely have their place, programs, and unfortunately the funding that those programs have is not sufficient, like so many things in this domestic family sexual violence sector. So unfortunately, for people who need to engage in addressing their harmful behaviours, they're maybe not getting timely intervention. And also we have to look at whether or not a group-based facilitation is appropriate for all perpetrators, because sometimes that can mean that they're actually reinforcing each other's behaviours if you maybe don't have a very skilled facilitator. So what I would say is there's a couple of things. Yes, we need these sort of interventions, but we need to also have them that have a culturally sensitive and appropriate approach for culturally and linguistically diverse communities and First Nations communities. Another huge issue is for perpetrators who have acquired brain injury or other cognitive issues. A standard program may not actually be the right for them. We've got to address the fact that you may in one group, and you'd have it as the minority, have some who may self-refer and be quite motivated, but the majority will actually probably be court mandated to attend, so there'll be quite a lot of resentment. The other issue that I see is a huge problem, and I'm one of the Victorian community members on the adult parole board here, is that what I have noticed, and I've been sitting on the board, I just got appointed July last year. So in my short time of my 3-year appointment that I've served so far, there's been a recurring theme relating to family violence offenders. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to sentencing of these types of crimes, typically, as I said, just bearing in mind that you've got only a small minority of people who actually report these instances, then those who do report and make it past initial police investigation and actually reach a criminal prosecution process, even a minority of those are actually going to make it to a custodial sentence. So those who actually, of all these offences that are happening on a daily basis, of the tiny minority that actually have to serve a prison sentence, this prison sentence itself for these are generally quite short in comparison to some other crime types. And what that means practically in terms of things such as parole and programs to address behaviours within prison is they're not serving a long enough sentence, one, to be considered as eligible for parole, or two, that they actually are eligible to do a behavioural-based program in prison. Or it might be that they are, but their sentence is too short. So by the time they've reached with the waiting list within the prison environment, they're already free. And the problem is that I've seen over and over again, also in working as an after-hours crisis response worker in family violence here in the Ballarat region, is when you have an offender who's served a prison sentence for family violence offending who gets out on what we would call straight release. So straight release is when you're not being released on parole. You've served your full sentence. That if you're released in that condition and not under parole conditions where you may have to be subject to electronic monitoring with an ankle bracelet, you might have a scram bracelet to monitor if you're consuming alcohol. You might have to go and do urine testing around drugs and other types of supports. You might have an exclusion zone that you're not allowed to go within that area or postcode or region. None of that happens if you're on straight release. So I've actually seen it happen in reality, where these offenders will get out and they'll just go straight back to reoffending against their victim, survivor and dependent children, and have actually escalated their behaviours to a whole other level. And it's just horrific, and you just think, oh my God, something's really wrong here. We need to actually look at this a different way, because otherwise more women and children are going to die.
Yes. I'd like to, some stage in the future, get you back just to talk about what's going wrong with our justice system in the support of family and domestic violence victims, because I think that's a huge issue, and it's not a simple issue. If it was a simple issue, I think we could solve it. But there's a number of things there, from sentencing to parole to enforcement of parole to things like when you get protection when you put something against someone so they can't come near you, the lack of effectiveness of it. I mean, it's a piece of paper which, let's be honest, a lot of times actually just is it just that, it's a piece of paper, and piece of papers don't protect anyone. All right.
But the thing is, when people say intervention orders are just a piece of paper, it's an important piece of paper, because it then gives law enforcement agencies grounds to escalate things to a criminal process should it actually be breached.
True. I was speaking to someone this morning, and they were describing their one of their relationships where I guess it's coercive control was definitely in play, and they talked about self-worth being broken down, the isolation from the family, the financial control, the self-erosion of complete self-worth, so much so that they thought that they were fully dependent upon this person. No one else would ever, value them or have any worth with them. And I might be wrong, but is it hard for people in that situation, when that's that gradual erosion of themselves and their self-worth, to actually realise what's going on?
Absolutely. It is. I've gone through this now 2 times in my life, and it's horrific, because to lose that sense of self, I think that's one of the hardest things, because when I reflect now on it is now one of the legacies of the abuse that I've gone through, and I'm sure many other victim survivors would say the same thing, is it's really upsetting to me that this now means, as once a very trusting, open person, that it's made me have to become a lot more sort of closed in on myself and who I'll let into my bubble. It makes it very hard for me to trust men in particular. Not saying all men, because there's many absolutely beautiful men in the world, and those who perpetrate these type of offences are definitely in the minority, but the harm that minority causes is just so huge. But what I actually find more distressing in the not being able to trust men so much is the fact that this has made me question my ability to trust my own judgment and decisions. So when I look back on what I went through, I'll never be able to forget or forgive what I've gone through, and no victim survivor should ever be manipulated or expected into having to feel like they have to forgive that person. That's a very individual choice. But what I think I've got to a point in my own healing and recovery process is being able to forgive myself for being in those situations and doing what I had to do on a day-to-day basis just to survive the abuse. So what I like to, I guess, compare it to is that for me, it really felt like I was in my own private war zone, that you're trapped in your own prison, not even just of like the literal physical location that can feel like that, but you're a prisoner in your own brain as well, because like I said, it doesn't even take actually being physically or sexually harmed in those sort of literal senses, but it's the psychological abuse and the coercive control just becomes you trapped in that when you're in that situation, you have to find a way to exist in your daily reality. Just like when we look at the awful things that are happening around the world in war and conflict zones such as Gaza and the Ukraine, we can look from here in Australia where we're in extreme safety in comparison and think, how on earth can those people exist each day in such circumstances? But the fact is that everyone finds a way, even in the most awful situations, to actually get through. And sometimes when it comes to domestic and family violence, you have to be outside of the situation for it finally to click how bad it was. Because when you're in the reality of living in it, you're in survival mode. And that's why it's so important, yet again, that when family members, colleagues, when someone approaches a service such as police, such as healthcare providers, such as specialist family violence services, and they talk about these types of behaviours that they might be going through, and if you're picking up on some warning signs that you're concerned for someone you love, that you articulate that back to them and don't just pretend like you're not noticing it. I had that happen to me so many times, particularly the first relationship, because I didn't know how to articulate what was going on for me, but I'd be turning up at work with bruises all down my arm or broken bones and continually things happening, or that someone might even observe the abuse happening to me and witnessing it. No one ever intervened. No one said anything. And it emboldened the perpetrator, but it made me feel so alone and so isolated. And so it enables the perpetrator to actually gaslight you to a whole bigger degree, because when you're talking to them about how you're feeling uncomfortable about them doing certain behaviours towards you, they'll put this stuff back in your face, like going, oh, well, we were there and this was happening. No one said anything. Can't be that bad if no one says anything. No, and so, yeah, it really erodes your sense of who you are. And I think in the healing and recovery stage, which once you are safely out of the abuse, you're going to be in healing and recovery, honestly, for the rest of your life. You're not going to be sunshine, lollipops and rainbows just because you're not in the abuse. And for many people, they also experience a lot of post-separation abuse from their perpetrators too, particularly through legal systems and financial systems. But what I'd say part of the biggest challenge for so many survivors is that coming back to yourself. You're never going to be the person you were before the abuse, but it's finding a sense of who you are in the now.
Yeah.
Am I dead? Or is this one of those dreams? Those horrible dreams that seem like they last forever. If I am alive, why? Why? If there's a God or whatever, something, somewhere, why have I been abandoned by everyone and everything I've ever known, I've ever loved? Stranded. What is the lesson? What is the point? God, give me a sign or I have to give up. I can't do this anymore. Please just let me die. Being alive hurts too much.
just with coercive control, there seems to be, despite individual behaviours and individual, perpetrator traits, etc., there seems to be a lot of similarities in what people do in coercive controls to their victims. As far as I know, there's no playbook out there for how to control and manipulate people. Where do people actually? Is it a common thing that perpetrators have this thing in mind where they do this, then they do this, etc., etc., or how is it so ingrained that it happens time upon with people who may never meet or never even talk?
Well, I guess it's not going to happen in every situation where abuse exists, that if you're a child of a perpetrator that you will go on to be a perpetrator yourself. But I guess you have to look at that for quite a number of people who've grown up in situations of abuse, what they're witnessing becomes normalised behaviours, and they may go on to continue that cycle. And that's why having early intervention and respectful relationships programs within, right from the early years of school onwards, is so important. But when we say, is there a playbook? Well, yes, there is, but I'll come back to that in a moment. But in terms of that, why it seems like everyone has actually read the same sort of list of instructions, it's something that the incredible author, journalist and activist Jess Hill has written about in her book, See What You Made Me Do. And she actually referred to how across different contexts, domestic abuse in conflict zones and torture, interrogation, in human trafficking and sexual exploitation, that the tactics used to control and isolate and have power and to break someone down are all the same methodology. So when you're seeing that this type of tactics are used in all those contexts, you think, well, where has this come from? Well, yet again, it comes back to what are these learned behaviours that people have seen have actually been effective. But when I say there is a text, well, there's one that a pimp actually wrote in the United States, which is called Pimpology, which gives a guide to others who wish to engage in that type of exploitation of others and human trafficking, how to actually do that on a breakdown basis. And someone who's a huge fan of Pimpology and recommends it to his cult followers, and I'm going to refer to him as basically a cult leader because that's how he operates, is Andrew Tate. So this is one of his list of prescribed texts that he gets his minions to read.
Yeah. Speaking of Andrew Tate, and I don't like to even say his name because I think eventually the way to get rid of the Andrew Tates is to pay them zero attention. They
100%.
become meaningless or they become a non-entity. That's my thought, because I think the more we, I don't think he's going away by us countering his warped ideology. But
absolutely,
is social media a significant effect in this area, or is it the next generation that's coming on that we might have to see the effects of people cult leaders, as you said, like him?
I don't think we even need to wait till the next generation. It's happening right now. And when we look at the different types of just really radicalised extremist type groups that are forming on the basis of these online rabbit holes that people can get pulled down by the algorithms. And generally it's speaking to usually quite vulnerable, disenfranchised young men in particular. And so, like, just off the top of my head, there's the men's rights activists. And that's also very linked around the family court and family law side of things. We've got involuntary celibates, so that's known as the incel movement. And then there's MGTOW, so men who go their own way. But I'm just going to sort of bring up a note around the incels, because in particular have become so radicalised that it's led on to mass murder, particularly in the United States and Canada. And it can be linked right back to the Andrew Tates of this world. So, for example, I think it was at least 10 years ago, I'd have to go back and look up the date, but the young man in a university campus over in the United States called Elliot Rodger, he went and perpetrated mass murder with his targets being young women. And for him, he was killed by law enforcement at the time of that mass murder. What they found is he'd written a manifesto outlining his reasons for wanting to commit this mass murder and targeting women was because women weren't showing him any attention sexually and that he hadn't been able to get a girlfriend. Now, what that has meant for the broader incel movement is him being killed by the police. He became a martyr to their cause. And so for subsequent mass murders where women have been the key targets, they have actually cited Elliot Rodger's name as an inspiration for going to commit these murders. And something in a more contemporary basis that we've seen just this year in popular culture on Netflix is the miniseries Adolescence, where it's shown how someone can get drawn into that online cesspit, and it can change their thought structure on how they treat others with respect and lead to deadly outcomes. So that prompted, obviously, and quite rightly, a lot of discussion globally around these issues. And for many, it came as a shock that these subcultures and this radicalisation of particularly young men is occurring. But I think it serves as a really timely reminder that if we don't intervene and provide alternatives for our youths and positive role modelling, that things are going to keep going into that direction. And unfortunately, many more people will probably end up dying as a result.
Yeah. Do you think perpetrators, first of all, dehumanise their victims? Perhaps maybe also exhibit traits such as lack of empathy, and before they actually, and even afterwards, do you think the perpetrators do some sort of justification for their behaviour?
I think it is very different on a case by case basis. I mean, you can't. A lot of labels get thrown around like psychopath, sociopath, narcissist, and all, but it doesn't mean that every single perpetrator is actually got a clinical definition of those things. They might exhibit some form of narcissistic behaviour traits, but it doesn't mean they might meet the actual definition as per the diagnostic statistical manual sort of thing. So I think before we pathologise everyone, what we need to look at is, yet again, what leads people on to feeling like they need to have power and control over someone else. And it's what I see it's very similar to is like bullying. I never experienced bullying at school, but I've experienced bullying within a professional workplace environment. And that actually happened after I've survived the 2 abusive relationships. And I have to tell you, the closest that I've ever felt to being back in a situation of domestic abuse again is in the office of this one particular workplace bully that took me straight back into being back in that circumstance again. And so I think if people are who've never personally been in a circumstance of domestic abuse may be able to understand the dynamics of bullying a bit better, and the reasons why people may bully. I think there's so much that's alike in those circumstances. So I think the reasons are complex and various, but I think the broader thing across the board is that I think we're not in this day and age having a rite of passage for our young women and young men. So they're entering adulthood, I think, searching for their own identity and searching for behaving appropriately, behaving respectfully. When we look at our First Nations cultures around the world, where they actually have very integrated initiation rites of passage ceremonies for their youth in those communities to transition into adulthood, it's in a way we need to maybe go back to looking at how we can integrate something like that into our contemporary context.
Yeah. All right, changing tack a little bit because I have to, just because of time. Just want to ask you one more definition.
Sure.
Stalking. What is it?
Well, stalking is a pattern of behaviour directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. Now, stalkers use a variety of tactics, including but not limited to unwanted contact, including phone calls, texts, contact via social media, unwanted gifts, showing up or approaching an individual or their family or friends, monitoring, surveillance, property damage and threats. Sometimes stalking behaviours may seem small on their own, but when added together to make 4, so 4 stands for fixated, obsessed, unwanted and repeated. So if you've got that 4 in place, then you should record the behaviour and report it to police or specialist family violence services before it escalates further. Another really interesting thing that's been researched more in recent years is around the typologies of stalking. So there's 5 key stalking typologies. And so first one is rejected stalker. So what that means is the stalking typically arises after the breakdown of an intimate relationship, although family members or others with whom the stalker once shared a close bond may also be targeted. The initial motivation of the rejected stalker is to either attempt to mend the broken relationship or to seek vengeance for what they perceive as rejection. The second one is resentful stalker. So that's when stalking arises when the stalker perceives mistreatment, humiliation, or injustice directed towards them. Their victims may be acquaintances or strangers. The initial motivation behind the resentful stalker's actions is often a strong urge for revenge or a desire to even the score. Next one is intimacy seeker. So that stalking originates within a backdrop of loneliness and isolation, with victims ranging from complete strangers to acquaintances. Their primary drive of intimacy seeking is to forge an emotional bond and develop an intimate relationship with their target. Often the behaviour of these individuals includes holding delusions about the victim, such as the false belief that they are already engaged in a relationship despite no such connection existing. So that often happens in celebrity cases. The incompetent suitor is the fourth one. And so that means that they stalk due to feelings of loneliness or lust, and many target strangers or acquaintances. Unlike the intimacy seeker, their primary goal is not to forge a loving relationship, but rather to secure a date or engage in a short-term sexual encounter. And finally, the predatory stalker. So predatory stalking arises within the realm of deviant sexual inclinations and interests. Typically, the perpetrators are male and their victims are usually female strangers who become the subject of the stalker's sexual fixation. The type I went through was the first one, the rejected stalker. My first perpetrator, after I finally left him, after several attempts to leave successfully, he stalked me for 10 years.
Yeah. Because we are running low on time, just wondering, is there any positives you see in this field? Has there been any improvement for victims of either family violence or domestic violence or gender-based violence in the last few years?
Oh, absolutely. So when I look at my own personal journey from the early 2000s to now, so much has changed. So if I was to seek support at this point, if I was going through what I was going through back then, it would be completely different. The police would respond to my circumstances. It would just be, everything would be different to back then. So I hear a lot of people say, oh, nothing ever changes, but it does. Because once again, there's now a whole integrated service response network where services are actually talking to each other. Like in Victoria, we have the Family Violence Information Sharing Scheme, which allows, say, courts and police and health services and family violence specialist service to actually share information rather than being as siloed as what they used to be. And getting tied up in red tape. And so now it actually helps you get on with actually doing that risk assessment and providing the support and doing what you need to do, which ultimately is keeping more women and children alive. So 100% see that. And also my hope is as well as there being the justice responses to these issues, it's looking at from a health perspective. Currently, we spend over $22 billion a year in Australia on domestic family sexual violence related issues. But what gives me hope is when I look at it from the perspective of issues that we've experienced here in Australia and also overseas. But if we just focus on Australia, drink driving, cigarettes, and also seatbelt wearing. I'm 46 now, and in my lifetime, and I'm in yours as well, we've seen such a change in how the public engages and perceives and responds to those three issues. And this is the way we have to look at family violence and sexual violence, that we can't just go one campaign of awareness or one approach from one angle and stop. It has to be a consistent and persistent approach over many years, because even now we still have campaigns around cigarettes, drink driving, and now drug driving and seatbelts. But it's something in terms of what's seen as socially acceptable around those issues. Our perceptions have changed significantly. And what I would like to hope in, say, 20 years' time, when we look back to now, we're in a completely different place. Because who could have imagined 20 years ago that you wouldn't be able to go into your local pub and have a smoke at the bar?
Yeah, true. Societal change would be good. It'd be nice if we had the political will to actually drive that as well. But it'll be interesting in the next 3 years. I see we've got one party that may have a significant advantage if they did want to actually push for some changes, which might trigger maybe some behavioural changes or societal changes or attitude changes within society. But we will wait and see. But for now, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you again, Cathy. And I really thank you for your time, but I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Well, thank you so much for having me and to giving a platform to this issue and this conversation, because it's really important that people are aware of the fact that they don't have to go through these issues alone. And if they're in immediate risk, to call 000. And also, if they're not in immediate risk, to make certain to call somewhere such as 1-800-RESPECT or their local family or sexual violence specialist service to get support.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening to Voices from the Edge. If you like what we are doing, like the episode in the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss any future episodes and leave a positive review.